双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Awakening and To Let by John Galsworthy. Awakening. Through the massive skylight illuminating the hall at Robin Hill, the July sunlight at 5 o'clock fell just where the broad stairway turned. And in that radiant streak little John Forsyte stood, blue linen suited. His hair was shining, and his eyes, from beneath a frown, for he was considering how to go downstairs, this last of innumerable times, before the car brought his father and mother home, 4 at a time, and 5 at the bottom, stale, down the banisters, but in which fashion? On his face, feet foremost, very stale, on his stomach, sideways, paltry, on his back, with his arms stretched down on both sides, forbidden, or on his face, head foremost, in a manner unknown as yet to any but himself? Such was the cause of the frown on the illuminated face of little John. In that summer of 1909 the simple souls who even then desired to simplify the English tongue had, of course, no cognizance of little John, or they would have claimed him for a disciple. But one can be too simple in this life, for his real name was Jolyon, and his living father and dead half-brother had usurped of old the other shortenings, Joe and Jolly. As a fact, little John had done his best to conform to convention and spell himself first Jan, then John. Not till his father had explained the sheer necessity had he spelled his name John. Up till now that father had possessed what was left of his heart by the groom, Bob, who played the concertina, and his nurse, who wore the violet dress on Sundays, and enjoyed the name of Spraggins in that private life lived at odd moments even by domestic servants. His mother had only appeared to him, as it were in dreams, smelling delicious, smoothing his forehead just before he fell asleep, and sometimes docking his hair, of a golden brown color. When he cut his head open against the nursery fender, she was there to be bled over. And when he had nightmares she would sit on his bed and cuddle his head against her neck. She was precious but remote, because was so near, and there is hardly room for more than one woman at a time in a man's heart. With his father, too, of course, he had special bonds of union. For little John also meant to be a painter when he grew up, with the one small difference, that his father painted pictures, and little John intended to paint ceilings and walls, standing on a board between 2 stepladders, in a dirty white apron, and a lovely smell of whitewash. His father also took him riding in Richmond Park, on his pony, Mouse, so called because it was so colored. Little John had been born with a silver spoon in a mouth which was rather curly and large. He had never heard his father or his mother speak in an angry voice, either to each other, himself, or anybody else. The groom, Bob, cook, Jane, Bella, and the other servants, even who alone restrained him in his courses, had special voices when they talked to him. He was therefore of opinion that the world was a place of perfect and perpetual gentility and freedom. A child of 1901, he had come to consciousness when his country, just over that bad attack of scarlet fever, the Boer War, was preparing for the liberal revival of 1906. Coercion was unpopular. Parents had exalted notions of giving their offspring a good time. They spoiled their rods, spared their children, and anticipated the results with enthusiasm. In choosing, moreover, for his father an amiable man of 52, who had already lost an only son, and for his mother a woman of 38, whose first and only child he was, little John had done well and wisely. What had saved him from becoming a cross between a lapdog and a little prig had been his father's adoration of his mother. For even little John could see that she was not merely just his mother, and that he played second fiddle to her in his father's heart. What he played in his mother's heart he knew not yet. As for Auntie June, his half-sister, but so old that she had grown out of the relationship, she loved him, of course, but was too sudden. His devoted too, had a Spartan touch. His bath was cold, and his knees were bare. He was not encouraged to be sorry for himself. As to the vexed question of his education, Little John shared the theory of those who considered that children should not be forced. He rather liked the mademoiselle who came for 2 hours every morning to teach him her language, together with history, geography, and sums. Nor were the piano lessons which his mother gave him disagreeable, for she had a way of luring him from tune to tune, never making him practice one which did not give him pleasure, so that he remained eager to convert 10 thumbs into 8 fingers. Under his father, he learned to draw pleasure pigs and other animals. He was not a highly educated little boy. Yet, on the whole, the silver spoon stayed in his mouth without spoiling it, though De sometimes said that other children would do him a world of good. It was a disillusionment, then, when at the age of nearly 7, she held him down on his back, because he wanted to do something of which she did not approve. This first interference with the free individualism of a Forsyte drove him almost frantic. There was something appalling in the utter helplessness of that position, and the uncertainty as to whether it would ever come to an end. Suppose she never let him get up any more? He suffered torture at the top of his voice for 50 seconds. Worse than anything was his perception that De had taken all that time to realize the agony of fear he was enduring. Thus, dreadfully, was revealed to him the lack of imagination in the human being. When he was let up, he remained convinced that De had done a dreadful thing. Though he did not wish to bear witness against her, he had been compelled, by fear of repetition, to seek his mother and say, "Mom, don't let De hold me down on my back again." His mother, her hands held up over her head, and in them 2 plaits of hair, couleur de feuille morte, as Little John had not yet learned to call it, had looked at him with eyes like little bits of his brown velvet tunic, and answered, "No, darling, I won't." She, being in the nature of a goddess, Little John was satisfied, especially when, from under the dining table at breakfast, where he happened to be waiting for a mushroom, he had overheard her say to his father, "Then, will you tell De, dear, or shall I? She's so devoted to him." And his father's answer, "Well, she mustn't show it that way. I know exactly what it feels like to be held down on one's back." No Forsyte can stand it for a minute. Conscious that they did not know him to be under the table, Little John was visited by the quite new feeling of embarrassment, and stayed where he was, ravaged by desire for the mushroom. Such had been his first dip into the dark abysses of existence. Nothing much had been revealed to him after that, till one day, having gone down to the cow-house for his drink of milk fresh from the cow, after Garrett had finished milking, he had seen Clover's calf, dead, inconsolable, and followed by an upset Garrett. He had sought De, but suddenly aware that she was not the person he wanted, had rushed away to find his father, and had run into the arms of his mother. Clover's calf's dead. Oh, oh, it looked so soft. His mother's clasp, and her, "Yes, darling, there, had stayed his sobbing. But if Clover's calf could die, anything could, not only bees, flies, beetles, and chickens, and look soft like that. This was appalling, and soon forgotten. The next thing had been to sit on a bumblebee, a poignant experience, which his mother had understood much better than De, and nothing of vital importance had happened after that till the year turned, when, following a day of utter wretchedness, he had enjoyed a disease composed of little spots, bed, honey in a spoon, and many tangerine oranges. It was then that the world had flowered. To Auntie June he owed that flowering, for no sooner was he a little lame duck than she came rushing down from London, bringing with her the books which had nurtured her own berserker spirit, born in the noted year of 1869, aged, and of many colors. They were stored with the most formidable happenings. Of these she read to Little John, till he was allowed to read to himself, whereupon she whisked back to London and left them with him in a heap. Those books cooked his fancy, till he thought and dreamed of nothing but midshipmen and dhows, pirates, rafts, sandalwood traders, iron horses, sharks, battles, Tartars, Red Indians, balloons, North Poles, and other extravagant delights. The moment he was suffered to get up, he rigged his bed fore and aft, and set out from it in a narrow bath across green seas of carpet, to a rock, which he climbed by means of its mahogany door knobs, to sweep the horizon with his drinking tumbler screwed to his eye. In search of rescuing sails, he made a daily raft out of the towel stand, the tea tray, and his pillows. He saved the juice from his French plums, bottled it in an empty medicine bottle, and provisioned the raft with the rum that it became, also with pemmican made out of little saved-up bits of chicken sat on and dried at the fire, and with lime juice against scurvy, extracted from the peel of his oranges, and a little economized juice. He made a North Pole one morning from the whole of his bedclothes except the bolster, and reached it in a birch-bark canoe, in private life the fender. After a terrible encounter with a polar bear fashioned from the bolster and 4 skittles dressed up in Dawes' nightgown. After that, his father, seeking to steady his imagination, brought him Ivanhoe, Bevis, a book about King Arthur, and Tom Brown's school days. He read the first, and for 3 days built, defended and stormed front de Burf's castle, taking every part in the piece except those of Rebecca and Rowena, with piercing cries of "En avant," "De Bracy," and similar utterances. After reading the book about King Arthur, he became almost exclusively Sir Lamorak de Gallas, because, though there was very little about him, he preferred his name to that of any other knight, and he rode his old rocking horse to death, armed with a long bamboo. Bevis he found tame. Besides, it required woods and animals, of which he had none in his nursery, except his 2 cats, Fitz and Puck Forsyth, who permitted no liberties. For Tom Brown he was as yet too young. There was relief in the house when, after the 4th week, he was permitted to go down and out. The month being March, the trees were exceptionally like the masts of ships, and for little John that was a wonderful spring, extremely hard on his knees, suits, and the patience of who had the washing and reparation of his clothes. Every morning the moment his breakfast was over, he could be viewed by his mother and father, whose windows looked out that way, coming from the study, crossing the terrace, climbing the old oak tree, his face resolute and his hair bright. He began the day thus, because there was not time to go far afield before his lessons. The old tree's variety never staled. It had mainmast, foremast, topgallant mast, and he could always come down by the halyards or ropes of the swing. After his lessons, completed by 11, he would go to the kitchen for a thin piece of cheese, a biscuit and 2 French plums, provision enough for a jolly boat at least, and eat it in some imaginative way. Then, armed to the teeth with gun, pistols, and sword, he would begin the serious climbing of the morning, encountering by the way innumerable slavers, Indians, pirates, leopards, and bears. He was seldom seen at that hour of the day without a cutlass in his teeth, like Dick Needham, amid the rapid explosion of copper caps. And many were the gardeners he brought down with yellow peas shot out of his little gun. He lived a life of the most violent action. "John," said his father to his mother, "under the oak tree, is terrible. I'm afraid he's going to turn out a sailor, or something hopeless. Do you see any sign of his appreciating beauty? Not the faintest. Well, thank heaven he's no turn for wheels or engines. I can bear anything but that. But I wish he'd take more interest in nature. He's imaginative. Jolyon." "Yes, in a sanguinary way. Does he love anyone just now?" "No. Only everyone. There never was anyone born more loving or more lovable than John. Being your boy, Irene." At this moment little John, lying along a branch high above them, brought them down with 2 peas. But that fragment of talk lodged thick in his small gizzard. Loving, lovable, imaginative, sanguinary. The leaves also were thick by now, and it was time for his birthday, which, occurring every year on the 12th of May, was always memorable for his chosen dinner of sweetbread, mushrooms, macaroons, and ginger beer. Between that 8th birthday, however, and the afternoon when he stood in the July radiance at the turning of the stairway, several important things had happened. Worn out by washing his knees, or moved by that mysterious instinct which forces even nurses to desert their nurslings, left the very day after his birthday in floods of tears to be married, of all things, to a man. Little John, from whom it had been kept, was inconsolable for an afternoon. It ought not to have been kept from him. 2 large boxes of soldiers and some artillery, together with the young buglers, which had been among his birthday presents, cooperated with his grief in a sort of conversion, and instead of seeking adventures in person and risking his own life, he began to play imaginative games, in which he risked the lives of countless tin soldiers, marbles, stones, and beans. Of these forms of Chera cannon he made collections, and, using them alternately, fought the Peninsular, the 7 Years, the 30 Years, and other wars, about which he had been reading of late in a big history of Europe which had been his grandfather's. He altered them to suit his genius, and fought them all over the floor in his day nursery, so that nobody could come in, for fearing of disturbing Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, or treading on an army of Austrians. Because of the sound of the word, he was passionately addicted to the Austrians, and finding there were so few battles in which they were successful, he had to invent them in his games. His favorite generals were Prince Eugene, the Archduke Charles and Wallenstein, Tilly and Mack. Music hall turns he heard his father call them one day. Whatever that might mean, one really could not love very much, Austrian though they were, for euphonic reasons. 2. He doted on Turin. This phase, which caused his parents anxiety, because it kept him indoors when he ought to have been out, lasted through May and half of June, till his father killed it by bringing home to him Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. When he read those books, something happened in him, and he went out of doors again in passionate quest of a river. There being none on the premises at Robin Hill, he had to make one out of the pond, which fortunately had water lilies, dragonflies, gnats, bulrushes, and 3 small willow trees. On this pond, after his father and Garrett had ascertained, by sounding that it had a reliable bottom and was nowhere more than 2 feet deep, he was allowed a little collapsible canoe, in which he spent hours and hours paddling, and lying down out of sight of Indian Joe and other enemies. On the shore of the pond, 2. He built himself a wigwam about 4 feet square, of old biscuit tins, roofed in by boughs. In this he would make little fires, and cook the birds he had not shot with his gun, hunting in the coppice and fields, or the fish he did not catch in the pond because there were none. This occupied the rest of June and that July, when his father and mother were away in Ireland. He led a lonely life of make-believe during those 5 weeks of summer weather, with gun, wigwam, water, and canoe, and, however hard his active little brain tried to keep the sense of beauty away, she did creep in on him for a second now, and then, perching on the wing of a dragonfly, glistening on the water lilies, or brushing his eyes with her blue as he lay on his back in ambush. Auntie June, who had been left in charge, had a grown-up in the house, with a cough and a large piece of putty which he was making into a face, so she hardly ever came down to see him in the pond. Once, however, she brought with her 2 other grown-ups, little John, who happened to have painted his naked self bright blue and yellow in stripes out of his father's watercolor box, and put some duck's feathers in his hair, saw them coming, and ambushed himself among the willows. As he had foreseen, they came at once to his wigwam and knelt down to look inside, so that with a blood-curdling yell he was able to take the scalps of Auntie June and the woman grown-up in an almost complete manner before they kissed him. The names of the 2 grown-ups were Auntie Holly and Uncle Val, who had a brown face and a little limp, and laughed at him terribly. He took a fancy to Annie Holly, who seemed to be a sister too. But they both went away the same afternoon, and he did not see them again. 3 days before his father and mother were to come home, Andy June also went off in a great hurry, taking the grown-up who coughed and his piece of putty, and Mademoiselle said, "Poor man, he was very ill. I forbid you to go into his room."
John.
Little John, who rarely did things merely because he was told not to, refrained from going, though he was bored and lonely. In truth, the day of the pond was past, and he was filled to the brim of his soul with restlessness and the want of something, not a tree, not a gun, something soft. Those last 2 days had seemed months in spite of Cast Up by the Sea, wherein he was reading about Mother Lee and her terrible wrecking bonfire. He had gone up and down the stairs perhaps 100 times in those 2 days, and often from the day nursery, where he slept now, had stolen into his mother's room, looked at everything,